Chapter 9. When Harriet and Max returned home in late morning the following day, Higgins was waiting for them. His eyes went back and forth between Max and Harriet, wondering how much he should say in front of Max. Finally he said, "I need to talk to you." His eyes were on Harriet, but he didn't insist on being alone with her for their conversation. Harriet went into her parlor with him, and looked over her shoulder waiting for Max to join them. He raised an eyebrow as if to ask if she was certain, and she nodded. They sat on the sofa together, while Higgins sat in a chair. As soon as they were seated, Higgins spoke. "Mr. Anderson is dead." The words were spoken bluntly and quickly. Harriet nodded slowly. She didn't ask who'd killed him, but Harriet obviously assumed it was him. "Will there be a trial?" she asked. Higgins shook his head. "Mr. Anderson was beating Mrs. Anderson again last night. I was watching through the window to make certain he didn't hurt her worse than I expected. Her son came in just as I was about to interfere, and he broke a vase over his head. The man fell and hit his head on the corner of their table. He was dead when I checked him." Harriet breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm so glad you didn't have to be the one to do it. I got the sheriff and he told the boy that he wouldn't be held accountable for it. He said it was in defense of his mother and all was fine in his eyes." Higgins looked down at his hands, which were gripped together tightly. "You know I have some money saved. You've paid me very well during the years I've been in your employ. Mrs. Anderson has no way to support herself and her son. I'm going to ask Mrs. Anderson if she'll be my wife. I can support all three of us with no problem." Harriet nodded. "I think that's a fine idea. I hope you'll continue to work for me." Higgins smiled, shaking his head. "You don't need me anymore. You have Mr. Farmer now, and he takes very good care of you." As much as he hated to leave her employ, he knew it was time for him to break the ties between them. "If I have a job that I want your special skills for, may I contact you?" she asked. Harriet had Higgins do a great deal of detective work over the years, following men and finding out what they were like. Higgins knew that was the type of work she was referring to and nodded. "I'd like that very much. The extra money will be nice, and I will be able to use my skills to help others." Harriet stood with tears in her eyes. "I'm going to miss having you at my beck and call, you know. You've been a good father to me ever since I lost my own." She hated the idea of seeing him go, but knew that it was time for both of them. To Max's surprise, Higgins stood and spread his arms wide, and Harriet walked into them, hugging him tightly. Higgins wrapped his arms around Harriet, hugging her as a father would hug a young daughter. "I'll miss you, but I'll be here if you need me." He laughed softly. "We're all talking like it's automatic the woman will marry me." Harriet looked up at him, wiping her eyes. "You know as well as I do it is. She has no choice. Someone needs to build a house where women who are abused can take their children and run to." She sighed. "I really hope someone does that someday." She stepped back, taking Max's hand in hers. Max was befuddled by the true affection he'd seen between them. Trust, yes, he'd seen that from the first moment Harriet had arrived, but that kind of affection truly surprised him. They really did think of one another as father and daughter. He held his hand out to Higgins. "You'll be welcome here at any time. If you need your job back, it's yours." Harriet leaned her head against Max's shoulder, thankful he finally understood. Higgins nodded gravely. "Thank you." He walked toward the door, but turned to them just before he reached it. "I have a marriage proposal to make." Harriet thought he looked happier than she'd ever seen him. As Higgins walked through the streets of Seattle toward Mildred Anderson's home, he couldn't help but worry about her reply. No, he wasn't asking her to marry him because he loved her, although she was a fine woman and he could see that coming with time. He was asking her to help her. He liked the idea of being married again, though, especially to such a special woman. When he reached the small house belonging to the Andersons, he knocked once, and stood back waiting for someone to come to the door. Mildred opened the door, wearing a bright red dress. "John. Come in." She held the door wide for him. "Forgive my dress. Alex told me I had to wear this dress today, because it wasn't black. He says we're not allowed to mourn." She shrugged helplessly, as if feeling she needed to explain her attire. Higgins shook his head. "You shouldn't mourn a man who has hurt you for years." "Alex is right." Mildred sighed. Obviously she'd expected Higgins to agree with her, but he simply couldn't. "Have a seat." She led him into the parlor and waited as he sat down. "Would you care for some tea? Or maybe some cookies? I made cookies just yesterday afternoon." She hovered over him as she waited for his response. He shook his head. "No thank you. I really just came over to talk to you about what you'll do now." Mildred shook her head. "Alex wants to drop out of school and work in the lumber camps to support me. I want him to finish, but I don't know what else to do. Do you know of a family who wants to hire a cook?" Higgins shook his head slowly. "I don't, but I do have a proposition for you. I've been a butler for many years, and have worked for a very generous woman for the last 10. I have more money in savings than a family would ever need, provided they were willing to live simply." He took her hand in his, not surprised to see the shock in her eyes. "Why don't we marry, and I'll support you and Alex? We wouldn't have to have relations until you were ready, and if you were never ready, that would be fine as well. Let me help you, though." Mildred stared at him in shock. "Why would you do that?" "Because I feel that in some way it will atone for the death of my daughter." "I know that's a strange reason, but it's the true one. I also feel like you would be a good wife to me, and someone I could fall in love with over time." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I would be a good husband to you, and a good father to Alex. I think it's a good solution, but it's up to you." He waited quietly for an answer, holding his breath as she grappled with the decision. Mildred sat silently for a moment, as if thinking about what he'd said. "It would solve a problem for me, but I still don't understand what it does for you, John." "It won't bring your daughter back." "No, it won't, but it will make me feel like I've done something about a problem in our world. It's not much, but it's something. I'll have to talk it over with Alex." She made a face as if she hated that idea. "No you won't, Ma." Alex's voice came from the kitchen. He stepped into their view. "I've been listening to every word, and I think it's the perfect solution. He's a good man. He helped us when we needed it most, and he's back to help us some more. I'd be proud to call him my father." Higgins smiled at the boy, realizing they understood one another well. Alex was a good boy, and someday he would be a good man. Higgins would do everything he could to mold him into that good man. His eyes met Mildred's again. "Well?" Mildred bit her lip for a moment before nodding. She was obviously reluctant to marry again right after she'd just gotten out of a horrible marriage, but she didn't feel like she had a choice if she wanted her son to finish school. "I'll marry you." "Good." Higgins stood up and pulled her to her feet by the hand he still held. "Alex, would you like to witness a wedding today?" Alex smiled, his eyes dancing. "Today?" "Sure." He walked to the door and opened it. "Our preacher will do it." He looked happy at the idea. An hour later, the trio was a family, and Higgins felt like he'd done the right thing. He squeezed Mildred's hand as they left the church and walked toward a small restaurant he had eaten in once or twice. Mildred shook her head as she saw where Higgins was leading them. "No. I can't let you spend money on a restaurant. I'll cook at home for us." Higgins pulled her along to the restaurant. My beautiful bride will not be cooking on our wedding day. Higgins was adamant. Mildred blushed. Some beautiful bride with this black eye. She lifted her hand indicating the bruising covering half of her face. Higgins smiled. Without that black eye, you'd never have agreed to be my wife, so I like it. He smiled over at Alex. You'll like this place. It's inexpensive, but the food is excellent. Alex shrugged. Sounds good to me. Mildred seemed bewildered by the way the two of them kept taking things over. She sat quietly while Higgins and Alex talked throughout the meal. Do you have any idea what you want to do with your life after school? Higgins asked as he forked up a bite of pot roast. You don't really want to work in the lumber camps, do you? Alex shook his head adamantly. I want to be a lawyer. I want to help women who are being hurt by their husbands. There should be laws against that. He looked over at his mother like he wished he could have stopped her abuse sooner. Higgins nodded emphatically. And there should be places that women can go and take their children when they are being abused. They shouldn't have to worry about where their next meal will come from. I agree. Alex went into a tirade about how many times he'd tried to get his mother to leave his father with him, but she'd always worried about how she would support him on her own. My ma would have let herself die before leaving, just because she was worried about what I would eat. Higgins sighed. It's always that way. My former employer and I have helped countless women out of that situation over the years, and the women always say the same thing. They can't support their families on their own. I wish I had an answer to the problem. Alex stared down at his fried chicken, pushing it away after a minute. I do too. Someday I will. Higgins smiled at the boy's spirit. He'd help him in any way he could. They had a similar passion. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Max went to the lumber camp soon after Higgins left, and Harriett felt like she was rattling around in the huge house. She knew Max didn't want her to work again, but she needed to find something to do to fill her time. Finally, after an hour, she put on a light wrap and left the house, wandering aimlessly through the streets. She hadn't walked far when she saw a large house with a big "For Sale" sign in the front yard. She walked closer and peered in the window at the front of the house to see what it looked like inside. May I help you? A voice asked from the street. The man was impeccably dressed and had his dark hair cut short. Harriet turned, embarrassed to be found sneaking a look at the house. Are you the one selling the house? The man nodded. The former occupants have moved back east and have asked me to take care of its sale for them. I'm Jeremy Wilson. He approached across the yard and held out his hand for her to shake. How big is the house? Harriet looked back toward it, an idea sparking in her mind. 8 bedrooms, he told her. The couple who lived here hoped to have many children, but they moved back east before even starting their family. The wife needed to get back to civilization. The house was beautiful and looked to have been built in the past 5 years. It was obvious it hadn't been vacant for long. May I see it? Jeremy nodded. Yes, of course. Are you looking to move? Harriet shook her head absently. No, but I may be in the market to buy a house if this is the right one. He unlocked the door and she followed him inside, looking around her. All the furniture had been left behind and was covered with white sheets. The air was slightly dusty, as if the house had been vacant for a short while. She followed him through the house and up the long flight of stairs. By the time they reached the top, her leg throbbed, but she wanted to see every room. How much are you asking for it? She asked when she saw the house would be perfect for her purposes. The man named a figure that made Harriet wince. She shook her head sadly. That's a little too much for what I have in mind. I'm sorry, I wasted your time. She reached out to shake his hand and turned away, intent on getting down the long flight of stairs. This house would have been perfect, but she was certain there were other houses in Seattle that would work just as well. Now that she knew what she wanted to do, she'd search for the right house. "Wait," Jeremy called. "How much do you want to spend?" Harriet turned back to him and named a figure much lower than the one he'd told her he was asking for. He shook his head a bit and named a figure in the middle. Harriet thought about it for a moment and nodded, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Thank you." She shook hands with the man. "I can bring you cash or a bank draft whenever you're ready for it." Harriet had the money from the sale of her parents' house and from the sale of Arthur's house in New York. She had purchased the house in Beckham with a small amount of the proceeds, but she could sell that house now too. Yes, purchasing something so large would be a drain on her funds, but she had plenty. Jeremy gave her a card with his name and address printed on it. "Come by and see me Monday morning. A bank draft will be perfect." Harriet was ready to dance with excitement. She couldn't wait to find Higgins and tell him what she'd done. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Higgins sat looking at Harriet in her small parlor, wondering why she'd sent for him. Did she already have someone she needed him to investigate for her? "How may I help you, Mrs. Farmer?" he asked politely. He was surprised at how much he resented being dragged away from his new family. Harriet's eyes danced as they met Higgins's. "I've done something, and I haven't even told Max about it yet." Higgins raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What did you do?" "I bought a huge house 2 streets over. There are 8 bedrooms." She looked at him as if she expected him to understand exactly what her words meant. He stared at her with confusion for a moment before asking, "For the women? The abused women?" She nodded. "Would you and your new wife be willing to be caretakers of the house? You can have 2 of the rooms, so her son can stay there with you." Her eyes pleaded with him to say yes. "I can't imagine she wants to stay in the house where she was treated so badly." Higgins thought about it for a moment. "I'll talk to Mildred, but I think she'd like to help other women in the same situation she was in." He smiled, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "We could take in as many as 6 women at a time as long as they didn't have more than 1 or 2 children each." "I know. I was thinking if she doesn't mind, your Mildred could cook for them, and you could take care of anything that needs to be done." She sighed. "There wouldn't be a lot of money for paying you, but I'd make sure you got all your food and your lodging free." Higgins shook his head. "I wouldn't accept payment for my time. Helping women get away from men who abuse them is my passion as well as yours." He frowned. "How will you fund the house?" Harriet shrugged. "I have purchased the house outright with money from the sale of my parents' home. Max doesn't want me to use any of my money anymore, so this is something I can do with it. When the money I have runs out, we'll do fundraisers to make ends meet. We'll do whatever it takes to get battered women away from their abusers. We'll call it the Seattle Home for Battered Women." Harriet smiled. "I like that." She looked up as Max stepped into the room. She'd purposefully left the door open, so if he arrived home from work and she was sitting there with Higgins, he would know he was welcome. "Please join us, Max." Max walked in and sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his and kissing her cheek. "What are you doing here today, Higgins? How is married life?" "Married life is very good, sir. I came over today because Mrs. Farmer had something she wished to discuss with me." Max's eyes went to Harriet. "Something important?" His eyes met hers questioningly. Harriet bit her lip. She'd agreed to purchase the house on Thursday afternoon, and here it was Monday evening, and she had yet to tell Max what she'd done. She wasn't deliberately hiding things from him, but she didn't think to tell him every little detail either. She knew she needed to work on doing that. "I bought a house this morning." Max shook his head in disbelief. "You don't like this one?" I love this house, Max. Her free hand covered his. I purchased a house for women who have been abused and have nowhere to go. Higgins and Mildred are going to run the house for me. When did you decide to do this? She sighed. Thursday afternoon. I should have told you. I wasn't trying to hide it from you, but I was trying to make sure I had everything worked out for it, so I could tell you what we were going to do. She paused, staring up at him, her eyes pleading with him to understand. Higgins and Mildred will live there rent-free, and they'll take care of the women who come in. There will be room for up to 6 women and their children. Meals will be provided and they'll be helped until they can get back on their feet and support themselves. I wish you'd told me sooner, but I can't complain that you're helping people. I wish there had been someone to help you when you were in a bad situation. His eyes looked sad as he said the words, and she knew she had a lot to make up for. Higgins excused himself and left, promising to come back the following morning after talking to Mildred and Alex. He strode for the door with a slight smile on his lips, and Harriett thought for a moment that it was good to see him happy. She turned to Max more fully. I bought the house without even really knowing I was looking for one. I had the idea of starting a home where women could go to be taken care of after an abusive marriage when Higgins said he was going to marry Mildred. I went for a walk after you went to work on Thursday, because I was feeling useless with nothing to do. You don't want me to work, but you'd said I could do volunteer work for a charity, and I was walking along thinking about what charity I would help, because I need something to do. She paused, looking up at him for understanding. I saw the house for sale, and suddenly something clicked in my mind. I went up and looked in a window, and the solicitor left in charge of selling the house saw me there. He showed me around and we negotiated a price. Max nodded slowly. So now this is the charity you'll be helping with? She laughed. You and I both know I'll be running this charity with Higgins's help. And the new Mrs. Higgins, of course. She shrugged. I have to do this, Max. I'm sorry that I wasn't more honest with you about my plans, but I have a burning need inside me to help the women who have been abused. I have to make this work. Can you understand that? Max gathered her into his arms. I think starting this charity is a very good idea. I think you'll do an excellent job and help a lot of women. He pulled back and looked down into her eyes. I just wish you would tell me these things before you tell your butler. I know, and for that I'm truly sorry. I've gone to Higgins first about so many things over the years that I don't even realize I'm doing it anymore. He's been my father, closest friend, and confidant for all of my adult life. It's hard to remember that you need to know things before he does, because it's just so natural for me to go to him. I promise I'll try. He sighed. I just don't want to walk in on a conversation and hear you tell him he's going to be a grandfather, before you even tell me I'll be a father. Harriett's tinkling laugh filled the room. I promise you'll be the first to know when I'm expecting. She pressed a kiss against his lips. Every single time I'm expecting. He kissed her soft lips, content for the time being. I hope so, because I don't want to have to hurt the man for knowing about my child before I do. Harriett grinned. There's no need to worry about that. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. For the next month, Harriett worked night and day to get the house ready and open to the public. Higgins and his new family moved into the house and began preparing it for others. When Mildred saw Harriett again, she dissolved into tears, walking into the other woman's arms. I'm so sorry, I refused to tell you anything that day. I should have known there was more behind you than there seemed to be. Harriett hugged the woman tightly. I'm just happy you accepted Higgins's help and you're in a better situation now. Mildred blushed. John is wonderful. Thank you for sending him to me. Harriett was startled at the woman's use of Higgins's first name. She was sure she'd known what it was somewhere in her mind, but she couldn't have told anyone his name without thinking about it first. She was happy Higgins had found someone who obviously cared about him, though. He was a man who deserved all the happiness in the world. Are the rooms okay? Did you pick the best rooms for you and your son? Mildred nodded. Higgins said you'd insist we take the biggest bedroom for our own, but I feel bad doing it. Harriett shook her head adamantly. Don't. This is your permanent home. The others are guests here, some of them long-term guests, but guests just the same. The two women walked to the kitchen together. How would you feel about throwing a dinner party here for the upper class in Seattle? I'd love to be able to raise some money right here in the house, before it's put to use for its intended purpose. She'd been thinking about a dinner party for a while, and it made sense to do it in the home the women would be living in. I think that's a good idea. Mildred seemed to think about it for a minute. When do you think we should hold the party? In 2 weeks on a Saturday night. Can you cook for 50 or so people, or should I have my cook come over and help you? She eyed Mildred with a smile. I'll be sending my maids over to help serve, of course. Mildred looked startled at the number. I've never entertained more than 5 or 6 people in my home. I'll send our cook over as well as the maids then. We want everything to be perfect. She looked over at the ballroom, which was closed off from the rest of the house. I think we should have a huge party with dancing in the ballroom and everything. The guests I'm thinking about inviting will expect that. She pulled a piece of paper and pencil from her purse. I'll look into hiring a band. Can you handle the menu, or do you want to go over that together? Mildred looked at Harriett with wide eyes. I'm just a poor farmer's daughter who was married to a man who chopped down trees for a living. I'm not used to big, lavish parties. Her eyes showed the fear she felt at this new role she was being thrust into. Harriett smiled, patting her shoulder. You'll get used to them. Higgins says you're a wonderful cook. It's a good way to help other women like us. Mildred nodded gravely. John told me about what happened to you. I thought he had. Now you understand why I feel so strongly about helping women who are in the situation we were both in. I think we'll work well together. She looked around the lower floor. I'd rather not go upstairs if I don't need to, but are all the rooms ready? Are there beds and dressers and everything a woman will need in each room? Yes, I made certain of that. The only thing I think we should add is a cradle or 2 for the women who come in with young babies. Harriett scribbled a note to herself. I'll take care of that. She looked up as Higgins entered the room and went straight to his wife, kissing her cheek. Or rather, I'll tell Higgins to take care of it. She grinned up at Higgins, thankful that even though he was no longer her butler, they were still able to see one another as often as they did. Your wife thinks we need cradles for the women who may come here with young babies. Higgins nodded. I'll take care of it right away. He looked down at Mildred. Can you think of anything else we need? Mildred shook her head. I think everything is as it should be. Harriett smiled at the byplay between the two. Higgins really was happy. I'm going to have some business cards printed up with the address here for all of us to carry. I'd like us to each give them out to the pastors in town who may know of women who need to come here, and we'll each carry them so we can give them to women who are in need. That's a great idea, Mrs. Farmer. I'd love to be able to help another woman like you helped me. Harriett shook her head. I never helped you. Higgins did. I just set the ball in motion. She headed for the door. I'll go take care of the things on my list, and we'll get together in a couple of days. Everything will be planned perfectly. You'll see. Once she was gone, Mildred looked at Higgins. She seems very happy. She is. Finally. She's married to a good man who is slowly easing her fears. He's exactly what she's needed all this time. Mildred hugged her husband tightly. I can see that. And you're exactly what I've needed all my life. Alex walked into the kitchen then, his hand reaching into the cookie jar to take out a cookie. He grinned at his mother and new stepfather. Take it upstairs. He didn't say another word as he headed to the table to do his homework. Someday, when he was a lawyer, he'd come back here and help the women who lived here find their voices. He was glad his mother had found hers again. Chapter 10. With Max and Mary's help, they raised enough money to keep the home for battered women open for a long time. Harriett sat in Mary's parlor, quietly sipping tea with her while the girls were at school. I'm at a loss for what to do about Rose. I've talked to her about waiting to find a husband until she's 18, but she just won't listen to me. I wouldn't have listened at 16 either. I met the man of my dreams. She eyed her sister-in-law for a moment and decided it was time for her not to be so shy about her past. He started beating me on our wedding night. He finally pushed me down a flight of stairs and killed the child I was carrying. My leg will never be the same. No one was around, and despite how improper she knew she was being, she lifted the skirt of her dress and showed the scars from her surgery. It was broken so badly they didn't think I'd ever walk again. A surgeon was able to put the pieces back together, but he said he'd be surprised if it worked. She pulled her dress back down and looked at the shocked look on Mary's face. Your parents didn't try to stop you from marrying him? Harriett shook her head. No, and I doubt I'd have listened to them. Arthur had been beating his maids for years. If they'd investigated, they'd have heard at least one of the rumors and stopped me. She shrugged. Even after his death, people were certain he was the most wonderful man who had ever lived. He made fools out of everyone. How did he die? My butler shot him. He could see he was going to kill me. Harriett sighed. Please let me talk to Rose. I won't tell her my story if you don't want me to, but she needs to understand there's a reason for waiting until you're a little bit older before marrying and for investigating every man thoroughly. Mary seemed to consider it for a moment. Tell her as much as you need to in order to convince her, but as little as possible. Harriett nodded. She was no longer ashamed of what had happened to her. She felt like women needed to know that there were men out there who would hurt them if they were given a chance, and she was going to shout her story from the rooftops if she had to. I'll talk to her. Thank you. She looked into her teacup for a moment before asking, would you still be willing to investigate potential suitors for her when she turns 18? For all the girls? I want to give them choices of husbands, but I don't want them to make a stupid mistake. When I married, there was only one man, but I'd known him all his life and my parents had known his parents. It's different here. There are so many men for each woman and they're all clamoring around my daughters, because we're obviously rich. I don't care if one of my daughters marries the poorest man in town as long as he'll love her and he's a good man. Harriett nodded. Higgins and I will help you all you need, but I don't approve of marriage before the age of 18, and I won't be the one to find them a husband before then. I understand. How old were you when you married? I was 16 when I married and a widow on my 17th birthday. She shook her head. I was too young to marry and already a widow. I don't want that for your girls. I don't want that for anyone. I don't either. Mary stood and went to the maid who was hovering outside the door ready to help them. Would you bring Rose down here? The maid nodded and hurried off to find Rose. Do you want me to talk to her privately or with you here? Harriett asked. She wasn't averse to either one, but felt she could make more of an impact one-on-one. I'd like to stay if you don't mind. That's fine. Harriett thought it would be good if Mary knew what she said to Rose. Rose walked into the room, her hair done perfectly. I was about to go for a walk. What is it, Mother? She was scowling as she asked the question, obviously still angry that Mary had made her stop having boys over all the time. "I have something I'd like to talk to you about, Rose," Harriett said, patting the sofa beside her. "Can you spare your new auntie a minute of your time?" She watched the young girl carefully, hoping she was open to what she was about to share with her. Rose looked at Harriett, startled, but nodded. "What do you want to talk to me about?" Harriett sat back against the back of the sofa and studied Rose, wondering the best way to start. "Do you think you're old enough to marry?" she began carefully. "Of course, I am. I'm 16. Rose stuck her nose up in the air as if she knew that being 16 meant she was the queen. "You are 16, and a very beautiful 16. Let me ask you this. Do you think you know more about life than Iris?" Harriett had spent the time while waiting for Rose thinking about the best way to broach the topic with her. Rose made a face. "Of course, I do. Iris is just a baby. She's 5. Harriett nodded. "She's 11 years younger than you, so you have a great deal of life experience that she could benefit from, don't you?" Rose nodded. "Yes, I do. Do you know how old I am, Rose?" Harriett kept her voice soft and sweet. She definitely wanted Rose to think she was an ally and not the enemy. Rose shrugged her shoulders. "No idea. I'm 27. When you were Iris's age, I was 16. Do you know what I did when I was 16? She asked carefully. "No. I got married when I was 16. The man I married wasn't a good man. I'll go so far as to say I picked a very bad man to marry the first time." She paused, studying her niece. "I don't want to see the same thing happen to you. In my extra 11 years of life, I've come to the conclusion that no one should ever marry at 16. I think a girl needs to be at least 18 to marry, and then she should have help choosing the man she marries. She should have someone who will look at the man and tell her if he's good or bad." Rose made a face. "You mean like let my mother and father pick out my husband for me?" Harriett shook her head. "Oh, of course not. Here's what I'm thinking. I have a lot of experience matching the right man with the right woman because of the mail order bride agency I used to run. When you are within 2 months of turning 18, and I don't think you should have suitors before you're 18, I think you should give your parents a list of the men you like the best. Up to 10 names. I'll take that list and go through the men, talking to them and investigating them. I'll pick the best 3 of the men on your list. If there are only 2 good ones, I'll add another man. You can then spend time with those 3 men and pick out the one who you like best. Whoever you pick, as long as he is one of the 3, will be your husband." She paused. "Provided the man feels the same way about you, of course." Rose seemed to think about it for a moment. "Do you really think all that's necessary?" Harriett nodded. "There are some very bad men out there. Let me find out whether or not they want to marry you just because you're young, pretty, and rich. I want to make sure they care about you and will take care of you the way they should." She watched Rose's face carefully, hoping she'd presented everything in a way that would make Rose listen to her. Rose hesitated and then nodded. "I'll start working on my list now." She leaned over and hugged Harriett. "Thanks, Aunt Harriett. I know you just want what's best for me." She jumped up and ran from the room, looking like the excited girl she was. Mary looked at Harriett. "That was wonderful." She shook her head, shocked. "How did you do that?" Harriett shrugged. "I think she knew I was sincere." "That helps." "I was sincere too." Mary sighed. "My girls respond to you better than they do to me. I'm glad you're on my side." Harriett grinned over her teacup. "We'll settle down and make a plan for them when they're ready." She set her cup down. "I have an idea for how to make them more aware if you're willing." I think the girls should all do some volunteer work in the homeless shelter as they get older. Probably only Rose and Lily are old enough now, but the others are still much too young. As they sit and talk to the women, they'll learn that some men aren't afraid to hit the women they are supposed to love. It'll be good for them. Mary seemed to think about it for a moment. You don't think it will shock them too much? Harriett sighed. I wish someone had thought to shock me that way when I was that young. Girls need to understand what the world is like. I'll talk to their father about it. Mary was hesitant, yet not totally against the idea. Lily bounded into the room, wearing blue pants that day instead of her normal black ones. Hi, Aunt Harriet. Harriet smiled. Hi, Lily. Are those new pants? Lily looked down. They are. Do you like them? Harriet nodded. They look very comfortable. I wish I had the courage to wear pants. They're so much more practical than skirts. She didn't think Max would like other men looking at her backside in pants, though. Lily's figure was just starting to show, and within a few months, the girl would look positively indecent. Don't encourage her, Mary said with a frown. Harriet laughed. I have to encourage her. She's Max's favorite niece. Lily rolled her eyes. Along with Rose, Amaryllis, Daisy, Jasmine, Hyacinth, Violet, and Iris. The man can't make up his mind about who he likes best. But I'll be your favorite, Aunt Harriet. You can be my favorite. Along with the other 7, of course. For as long as I'm the only one in the room with you? Lily asked knowingly. I think I'll plead the Fifth Amendment on that one. Harriet grinned. What's the Fifth Amendment? Harriet took another sip of her tea. The Fifth Amendment says that you don't have to say anything that could be incriminating against yourself. Lily sighed. It's just as I thought. Tomorrow Iris will be your favorite. She rolled her eyes. Harriet turned to Mary, struggling to find a topic she could switch to without hurting Lily's feelings. I heard that hoop skirts are becoming all the rage in the East again. Mary grinned, hiding her smile behind her teacup. Oh, I certainly hope not. They're so difficult to wear. As soon as the 2 women began talking about fashion, Lily jumped up and left the room as quickly as she could. She didn't want them finding her ignorance of fashion lacking, and she knew they would. Harriet stood up with a smile. I need to get home. I want to be there when Max gets home tonight. She struggled to her feet. Mary stood hugging the taller woman. Is your leg up to the walk today, or should I have someone drive you home? The walk is good for me. I need to be as active as possible. Harriet headed for the front door, opening it and started the walk to their home. It was on the other side of town from where Mary lived with her children, but Harriet didn't mind. She enjoyed walking as long as it wasn't raining. She pulled her coat more tightly around her, the cold November breeze chilling her more than she would have liked. She realized about halfway home that she should have accepted the ride, but by then there was no point in going back, so she plodded on. When she arrived home, one of the maids was waiting in the entryway and took her coat from her. You look chilled to the bone, Mrs. Farmer. I'll get you some hot tea. Why don't you go wait in your parlor for it? Harriet nodded gratefully, going into the parlor and picking up a book she'd been reading. She couldn't wait for Max to get home and hear the news she'd been all but bursting with all day. The maid brought the tea and she heard the front door open just after that. Harriet called out for Max to join her for some hot tea. He walked into the parlor and greeted her with a kiss on the cheek like he always did. Your cheeks are red. Were you out in the cold today? He had been concerned that she was spending too much time at the battered women's house. I spent the afternoon with your sister and nieces. Mary has asked me to help her find suitable husbands for the girls when the time comes. Harriett rubbed her leg unconsciously. It's not time yet? I thought Rose was ready to marry next week. Max slipped his arm around her shoulders and leaned against the back of the couch. I convinced her that it's better if she waits until she's 18. She's going to present me with a list of her 10 favorite men. I'll sort through them and give her 3 choices. She'll choose from those 3. Max smiled at the simple solution. That sounds good to me. She'd make a terrible choice if left to her own devices. Harriett nodded, agreeing with him. She turned to face him on the couch, a secret smile playing at her lips. I have news. She knew she should prepare him better, but she was all but bursting with excitement. Max looked at her with a smile. What kind of news? It was obvious that whatever it was, she was pleased with it. You're going to be a father, she whispered. Max's smile slowly spread until it had overtaken his face. You're certain? He asked. I saw a doctor this morning. Harriett was thrilled to know she was pregnant. She had worried that the damage done to her body in her fall would keep her from being able to have a child. And I haven't told Higgins yet. He hugged her tightly. I couldn't be happier. She smiled up at him. Neither could I. I want at least 4 children. Max smiled, stroking her cheek. 4 is fine, but I feel like I'm surrounded by girls. Would you try to have at least 1 boy in the mix? I don't know how much control I have over that, but I'd be thrilled to have a little boy. She rested her cheek against his shoulder, feeling more secure and protected than she had since she was a child. Have I mentioned how much I love you? She knew she'd never said the words, but she finally felt like she'd burst if she didn't. Max went totally still for a moment, staring down at her. I didn't think you'd ever say that to me. I just couldn't before now. I'm not sure why, but every time I tried the words just stuck in my throat like a giant chunk of cookie. She reached up to stroke a strand of hair out of his eyes. I've felt it for a long time, though. Since before I ever left Massachusetts. I could see it in your eyes, but it makes me feel so much better to hear you say it. He dropped a kiss on her lips. I love you, too. More than I ever dreamed I could love anyone. He studied her for a moment. Are you going to keep working at the battered women's house? She nodded. I'll cut back the hours I'm there, though. I talked to your sister about letting Rose and Lily volunteer some time there today. I think they would learn a lot, but also do a lot to help the residents there. I think that's a really good idea. I don't want you doing too much. Harriett laughed. You're not going to be one of those husbands who thinks their wife needs to be wrapped in cotton while they're pregnant, are you? She hoped not, because she would go insane with boredom. Max shrugged sheepishly. I didn't think I would, but now that the time has arrived, I might just have to be. Harriett shook her head with a laugh. I'll be fine. What about your leg? Harriett frowned. What about my leg? The baby isn't growing in my leg, you know. She shrugged, certain her leg would be fine. I'm worried it will make it harder for you to walk. Will you be okay? I'll be just fine. I promise. Did you talk to the doctor about it? She couldn't keep the smile from crossing her lips. Yes, I talked to the doctor about it. He said there was nothing to worry about unless I gain a great deal of weight. Good. I don't want to have to carry you everywhere for the next 9 months, but I'll do it if I have to. He winked at her, letting her know he'd really do it happily. She laughed out loud. I think you would. She stroked his face, staring into his eyes. I really do love you, Max. He hugged her close. I love you, too. I'm so happy we're having a baby. She grinned. Me too. Secretly, she hoped this baby would be a little boy who looked just like Max. She could think of nothing she wanted more in life than a child with the man she loved more than life itself. Epilogue. Harriet leaned back on the couch and went through the pile of papers Higgins had brought her. It was just 1 month before Rose's birthday, and she was getting more than a little impatient as she waited for Harriet to give her the 3 men she had to choose from. She sorted the papers in the order she thought they should go in. 5 of the boys had been thrown out immediately because Higgins had found problems. 1 had a drinking problem, another had killed a man in a fist fight, yet another had a gambling problem. The other 2 were obviously after the money Rose's parents had offered as a dowry. Harriet looked through the remaining 5. She'd have to sit down with each of them and discuss their interest in Rose and see if it seemed genuine. Her niece wasn't going to marry any man who only wanted her for her money. Anna, her son's nurse, walked into the room carrying little Simon. She took him from his nurse's arms and held him close, absently unbuttoning the front of her dress so she could nurse him. The doctor had told her that morning to stop nursing soon, because she was already carrying again. She didn't want to give up her closeness with Simon, but she'd do just about anything for his younger brother or sister. She smiled at the thought of how Max's face would look when she told him. She heard the door slam open and looked up to see Rose rush into her parlor. "Aunt Harriet. I found another man. He's perfect for me. We have to add him to the list." She held up a sheet of paper with a single name on it. Harriet sighed. "This is the last edition. I've already gotten back all the information on the others, and was about to narrow it down to the best 3. Rose looked sheepish. "I'm sorry, but I was walking in the park today, and I saw him. He's beautiful and has the nicest teeth." Rose had a dreamy look on her face that reminded Harriet of how Hyacinth often looked. Harriet blinked. "Teeth? They're the most beautiful shade of white. He's a dentist. Not a barber, but a dentist. Do you believe?" She sank down onto the sofa beside Harriet. "He can fix my teeth anytime." Harriet laughed softly. "I'll have Higgins check him out, Rose. I'm not making any promises, though." "And are you sure he's interested in you?" Rose was so used to every man she met falling at her feet that she would be surprised if a man wasn't interested in her. "All the boys are interested in me." Rose sat up straight and gave her aunt a scathing look. "You know they're all interested. Even this one." Harriet just shrugged. "I'll do what I can, Rose." And she would. She'd do her best to find the best man for Rose, no matter what it took. Rose stood and walked toward the front door. "You're on Mama's side. You don't ever want me to marry." She slammed the door behind her. Harriet sighed, looking down at the name on the paper that Rose had given her. Higgins would be happy to check out one more man for Rose, but he was busy these days. The house was full to capacity, and Alex was about to graduate and was trying to find just the right university. Everyone was busy. Didn't Rose see that? Max came in a few minutes later. "What's with Rose? She just rushed past me and told me that all adults in her life are out to get her and never want her to be happy." Harriet laughed. She added a new man to her list. "He's a dentist. He can work on her teeth anytime." Max sat beside her on the sofa, chuckling. "That certainly sounds like Rose." His finger went out to stroke Simon's cheek before kissing hers. "How are my favorite people doing today?" "We're good." She played with a curl of Simon's hair as she nursed him. Higgins finished his investigations of the possible suitors for Rose. "I had to discard 5 of them, and then as soon as I'd done that she came in with another. I'll have to have Higgins check him out tomorrow." "Anything else exciting happen around here?" "Simon got his first tooth, and the doctor told me we're having another baby." She said the words as calmly as she could, hoping he would be shocked to the core. Max smiled at Simon for a moment, a tooth. That's great, Simon. He turned to look at her stunned. Wait. You're pregnant again already? She nodded, her eyes lit up with excitement. I want a girl this time, who I can raise to be independent and not have to marry the first man who makes eyes at her. Max shook his head. No girls yet. I want to have 3 boys before we have a girl. I need someone to help me fight off the boys. We need big sticks. Harriett just laughed. I don't think you have a lot of say in the matter, Max. It's up to God. She looked down at Simon as she wondered if he would be a man to fight for his sisters alongside his father. It seemed so far away. She finished nursing Simon and put him to her shoulder, patting his back gently to try to get a burp from him. Max held out his hands and expertly took the little boy and put him to his own shoulder. Harriett loved to watch Max with Simon because he was such a good father. He was as gentle as he needed to be. Max looked down at his son. If you get a sister this time, you're going to have to be ready to help me. Do you think you can do that? He asked. Simon turned his head to look at Max, seeming to understand every word, and then he let out a loud burp. Max met Harriet's eyes. Do you think that was a yes or a no? Harriett shrugged. I have no idea. I've long since given up trying to understand baby belches. Max sighed. I wish I could give up on it. It plagues my every thought. Harriett giggled softly. You're crazy, you know. He nodded. I do know. And I'm going to be a father again. Have I told you yet how much I love you? Not in the last few hours. Maybe I should remedy that. His lips settled against hers, content with the woman he'd waited so long to marry.